Have you ever wondered what it truly means to surrender everything to God? What would you do if the Almighty asked you to sacrifice the most precious thing in your life? Today we're diving deep into one of the most powerful and heart-wrenching stories ever told. A story that has echoed through the hearts of believers for thousands of years. This is the story of Ibrahim's ultimate test, a test so profound that it would forever change how we understand faith, obedience, and divine mercy. But here's what most people don't realize about this sacred narrative. This isn't just a story about one man's devotion. This is a mirror held up to every soul who has ever claimed to love God. It's a window into the very essence of what it means to trust completely, even when everything inside you screams to hold back. And by the end of this journey, you'll discover truths about faith that will shake you to your core. If you're ready to explore the depths of divine testing and the beauty of complete surrender, drop a comment below with the word surrender and let me know you're prepared for this spiritual journey. And don't forget to subscribe, because what we're about to uncover will transform how you see your own relationship with the Creator. Now let me take you back to a time when the earth was young and the voice of God still echoed clearly in the hearts of his chosen servants. Ibrahim, known to many as Abraham, was not just any ordinary man. He was Khalil Allah, the friend of God, a title so sacred that it speaks to a relationship deeper than most of us can fathom. This was a man who had already proven his faith time and time again, who had left everything behind to follow the divine call, who had faced trials that would have broken lesser souls. But what made Ibrahim so special? What set him apart from the countless other believers who walked the earth? It wasn't his wealth, though he was blessed with abundance. It wasn't his wisdom, though he possessed insight beyond his years. No, what made Ibrahim extraordinary was his willingness to say yes to God, even when that yes came with a price he couldn't yet understand. Think about this for a moment. Ibrahim had waited decades for the blessing of a child, decades of prayers, decades of hope deferred, decades of watching the years pass while his heart yearned for the laughter of a son, Sarah. His beloved wife had grown old alongside him, and still they waited. Can you imagine the weight of that longing? Can you feel the ache of unfulfilled dreams stretching across years that turned into decades? And then when hope seemed nothing more than a distant memory, when nature itself declared that the time for children had passed, God spoke, not with whispers or hints, but with a promise so clear it could not be misunderstood. Sarah would bear a son. Ibrahim would become the father of nations. The covenant would continue through his bloodline. When Ishaaq was finally born, imagine the explosion of joy that must have filled Ibrahim's heart. This wasn't just any child. This was the miracle child, the promise fulfilled, the answer to decades of prayer. Every gurgle, every smile, every tiny movement must have felt like a direct gift from heaven itself. Ibrahim had tasted the sweetness of divine mercy in its purest form. But here's where the story takes a turn that few expect. Here's where God reveals something profound about the nature of faith itself. Because while Ibrahim was reveling in the joy of fatherhood, while he was watching his son grow and learn and laugh, God was preparing the ultimate test. Not a test of Ibrahim's love for his child, but a test of his love for his Creator. Yet the command came in a dream, as divine communications often do. Clear, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. God spoke to his friend Ibrahim with words that must have stopped time itself. Take your son, your only son whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah there. Offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Can you feel the earth-shattering weight of those words? This wasn't a request or a suggestion. This was a command from the Creator of the universe to his most faithful servant. Take the miracle child, the promise fulfilled, the joy of your heart, and sacrifice him on an altar of stone. What must have gone through Ibrahim's mind in that moment? What arguments must have risen in his thoughts? What questions must have flooded his soul? This was the child of promise, the one through whom nations would be blessed. This was the son he had waited for, prayed for, loved beyond measure. How could God ask for this? How could the same voice that had promised blessing now demand such a sacrifice? Yet here is where we witness the true measure of Ibrahim's faith. Scripture tells us that he rose early in the morning. There was no delay, no hesitation, no attempt to negotiate with the Almighty. He saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men, split wood for the burnt offering, and set out for the place God had told him about. The man who had argued with God for the salvation of Sodom, who had questioned how he could have descendants when he was childless, now moved with silent obedience toward the most impossible command ever given. For 3 days they journeyed, 3 days of walking toward a destination that must have felt like the end of everything. 3 days of looking at his beloved son, knowing what lay ahead. 3 days of wrestling with a divine command that seemed to contradict every promise God had ever made. Can you imagine those nights around the campfire? Can you picture the internal storm raging in Ibrahim's heart while his face remained calm and determined? And through it all, young Ishaaq walked beside his father, trusting, innocent, unaware that he was walking toward an altar that would test not just his father's faith, but the very foundations of divine mercy itself. The boy who carried the wood for his own sacrifice, asking questions that must have pierced Ibrahim's soul like arrows. This is where our story pauses today, at this moment of unbearable tension, at this crossroads where faith and heartbreak collide. But don't close this chapter yet, because what happens next will reveal truths about God's nature that will leave you breathless with wonder. The 4th day dawned with a weight that seemed to press down upon the very air they breathed. As they approached the region of Moriah, Ibrahim's heart must have been beating like thunder in his chest. Every step forward was a step deeper into the mystery of divine will. Every breath a reminder that he was walking a path no father should ever have to walk. But then, something remarkable happened. Ibrahim lifted his eyes and saw the place in the distance, exactly as God had shown him in the vision. And in that moment, he made a decision that reveals the depth of his trust. He turned to his servants and said words that still echo through the corridors of faith today. Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Did you catch that? We will come back to you. Not I will come back, but we will come back. Even as Ibrahim prepared to obey God's command, even as he walked toward what appeared to be the destruction of everything he held dear, somewhere deep in his spirit, he believed that both he and his son would return. This wasn't blind optimism or desperate hope. This was faith operating on a level that transcends human understanding. Together, father and son began the final ascent up the mountain. Ibrahim carried the fire and the knife, while Ishaaq carried the wood for the burnt offering. The silence between them must have been deafening, broken only by the sound of their footsteps on the rocky path and the whisper of wind through the trees. Each step was a choice, each breath an act of surrender. And then came the question that must have nearly shattered Ibrahim's resolve. "Father," Ishaaq said, his young voice cutting through the morning air like a blade, "the fire and wood are here. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Where is the lamb?" 4 simple words that carried the weight of eternity. The innocence in that question, the trust in his father's wisdom, the expectation that somehow, somewhere, there would be provision for the sacrifice they were about to make. This wasn't just a child's curiosity. This was a moment when heaven and earth held their breath. Ibrahim's response reveals the heart of a man caught between human love and divine obedience. God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. These weren't empty words meant to comfort a child. They were a declaration of faith so profound that they still reverberate through the ages, even in the face of the impossible, even when every earthly indication pointed toward tragedy. Ibrahim chose to believe in the goodness and provision of God. They continued their climb in silence, but something had shifted. The question had been asked, the answer given, and now both father and son walked forward with a shared understanding that whatever lay ahead, God would provide. Not might provide, not could provide, but would provide. When they reached the place God had designated, Ibrahim began to build the altar. Stone by stone, he constructed what appeared to be the end of his dreams. Yet each stone was placed with the steady hands of a man who trusted completely. He arranged the wood with careful precision, preparing everything exactly as God had commanded. There would be no shortcuts, no half measures, no attempt to somehow soften what had been required. And then came the moment that defies every human instinct, the moment when faith transcends the boundaries of natural affection. Ibrahim bound his son Ishaaq and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Can you imagine the tenderness in that binding? Can you picture the love in those hands as they prepared to do the unthinkable? This wasn't the action of a man consumed by religious fanaticism. This was the surrender of a heart that had learned to trust God even in the darkness. Ishaaq, this remarkable young man, submitted willingly. He didn't fight, he didn't flee, he didn't question his father's actions. In that moment, he became a living picture of perfect trust, demonstrating a faith that matched his father's in its completeness. Here was a son who had learned to mirror his father's surrender, who understood that sometimes obedience to God requires us to walk paths that make no sense to human reasoning. Ibrahim reached out his hand and took the knife. The blade caught the morning light as he lifted it, and in that instant, time seemed to stop. Everything hung in the balance, every promise, every hope, every dream concentrated in that single moment of ultimate obedience. The man who had waited decades for this child was prepared to give him back to God, trusting that somehow, in ways he couldn't understand, God's purposes would be fulfilled. This is faith stripped of all pretense, all negotiation, all human scheming. This is trust so complete that it's willing to sacrifice the very thing through which God's promises were supposed to be fulfilled. Ibrahim wasn't just offering his son on that altar. He was laying down his own understanding, his own plans, his own vision of how God's will should unfold. But heaven was watching, and mercy was already on the way. Just as the knife was about to fall, the voice of heaven thundered across the mountainside. "Ibrahim! Ibrahim!" The angel of the Lord called out with an urgency that stopped the blade mid-air. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." In that breathtaking moment, everything changed. The test was complete, but not because blood had been shed. The test was complete because a heart had been fully revealed. Ibrahim had proven that his love for God surpassed even his love for the miracle child, that his trust in divine wisdom transcended his own understanding of how God's promises should unfold. And then came the provision that Ibrahim had declared with such faith. Caught in a thicket by its horns was a ram, provided by the same God who had asked for the sacrifice. The substitute was there all along, waiting for the moment when complete surrender would open the way for divine intervention. Ibrahim took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. And he called that place, "The Lord Will Provide." This story isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror reflecting back to us the very essence of what it means to trust God completely. Ibrahim's test reveals that true faith isn't about understanding God's ways, but about surrendering to His will. Even when that will seems to contradict everything we think we know about His character. Every one of us faces moments when God asks us to place something precious on the altar of surrender. It might not be a child, but it could be a dream, a relationship, a career, or a vision of how we think our lives should unfold. The question isn't whether the test will come, but whether we'll respond with the same wholehearted trust that marked Ibrahim as the friend of God. If this story has stirred something in your heart, if you've felt that call to deeper surrender in your own walk of faith, let me know in the comments below. Share what God is asking you to trust Him with today. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the stories of faith we explore here aren't just entertainment. They're invitations to transformation. Until next time, may you walk in the footsteps of Ibrahim, trusting that no matter what God asks of you, He will always provide.